Chapter 12, Arca Pharmaceuticals Headquarters, San Francisco. One entire wall of Lee's office was a huge glowing hologram. Along the bottom of the hologram ran a series of data packets, including the date 3 months ago. Milan Laboratories at Palo Alto, before the facility had been destroyed. Lee clenched his fists at the memory. Captain Young had suddenly risen up and bit her employer in the ass. She'd taken a huge bite out of him and had almost brought his entire project down. Years of work nearly destroyed because of one woman and the faceless men who'd helped her. He had a small part of the attack on tape, though it had been mostly destroyed by something the faceless men had done to his security system. His very, very expensive security system still burned. He'd recognized Young immediately, of course, brazenly breaking into his facility with the use of a cloned pass. The lab had been hidden and illegal, given the type of testing that had gone on. He'd had to go in and complete the destruction she'd wrought so that when the authorities came to investigate, he'd be able to plausibly state that the extra underground floor was merely equipment storage space. There hadn't been any technical experts in the law enforcement team, luckily, but he'd had to buy off 3 technicians who'd worked on the floor, and it had cost him money, time, effort. Flynn had placed him under pressure, then Beijing had placed him under pressure. That's not how science worked. Science proceeded at its own stately pace. Putting pressure on the scientific process was an abomination. This was something non-scientists like Flynn were simply incapable of understanding. What Lee was working on had the potential to change the world forever, as momentous as the harnessing of electricity. More so, even as it would change the nature of a part of humanity. This was not something that could be done in a hurry and sloppily. Injecting himself with SL-61 had been a stroke of genius, because he felt stronger and more intellectually acute than ever. He felt, for want of a better word, invincible. There had been a missing element, though, an element he discerned in an animal experiment on the hidden level 4, the night the laboratory was destroyed. How he'd loved level 4. It had been his very own reign, a place where he held the power of life and death, a place where he created living organisms, a place where he'd been a god. He'd carried out extensive animal testing on level 4 that would have been illegal under the animal testing bill. The experiments might have been illegal according to a bill passed by a lobby of fanatical men and women who cared more for dumb creatures than for science, but they had been necessary. He'd been testing iterations of SL that would increase strength and speed and intelligence. He and the SL drugs had been conducting a kind of dance. 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, then 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward, then 1 step forward and 3 steps backward, then 10 steps forward. Of course, it was immensely complex, as he was effecting change at the cellular level and trying to make it stable. He was speeding up evolution itself, something no one else in the history of the world had ever attempted. And he was succeeding, damn it. Every single trial that ended with a problem also unveiled a new possibility. It was impossible to explain that to moron Flynn. To his astonishment, though, it also proved impossible to explain to the Ministry of Science in Beijing. Nobody cared about the process, about the secrets to life itself, which he was unlocking. All they cared about were tangible results. A drug that would increase the capabilities of soldiers in the field, that would prove stable over time, and it was cheap to produce. In any hands but his, it would have been impossible. Up to that point, there had been 59 iterations, nothing compared to Edison's 10,000 failed attempts. Lee had only tried 59 times, but that 59th. Deep below the earth in the animal lab, Lee had found part of the key to changing the world in an animal cage housing a bonobo. There had been 10 bonobos, big healthy apes genetically predisposed to peaceful behavior. SL-59 had had a negative effect on 9 of them. They'd turned listless and died. But the 10th... Lee watched the holographic recording. He'd been watching it over and over again, while poring over the analyses of the blood and brain tissue. He'd gone back post-mortem to the original MRIs and had discovered something that had escaped his researchers' notice. A slight anomaly of the hypothalamus and increased temperature of the periaqueductal gray of the midbrain. Both qualities had increased notably after administration of SL-59. In the hologram, so clear someone else in the room would have difficulty in distinguishing between now and 3 months earlier. He stood before a transparent plexiglass cage, watching the beautiful animal inside. The hologram clearly showed all the data contained in the data info cubes at the forefront of the cage. Gender, genetic history, MRI and CAT scans, IQ test results, dosages, and times of injection of SL-59. The other bonobos had been sitting in their cages, movements slow, eyes lifeless. Bonobo number 8, though, he wasn't sitting listlessly. No. He was upright, well-balanced, brown eyes sharp. In the hologram, Lee stood studying him, and it was clear that the animal was studying him right back. The camera had been at Lee's back, so he couldn't see his own face, but he knew that he'd glanced down to see the EKG tracing at that point. Bonobos were peaceable within their own groups, but grew agitated in the presence of other species. Number 8's heart rate remained unchanged. Amazing. Either the bonobo had developed an ability to control its own heart rate, or an instinctive fear had been overridden by the drug, perhaps both. And then something remarkable had happened. The animal had checked Lee's hands for weapons and his eyes for intent. There had been no mistaking the raw intelligence in the animal. They had stood there for a minute or two, gauging each other, two beings on either side of a species divide. Then the bonobo had smashed itself against the plexiglass, trying to get at him, beating itself into a pulp. But those few minutes had been enough to give Lee an insight into attenuating the intensity of the violence, while retaining the intelligence, and that insight had led to a virus-born bit of genetic engineering that he thought represented the breakthrough they needed. SL-59 hadn't worked, and SL-60 hadn't worked, but SL-62, and an hour ago he'd injected himself with the drug. In the hologram, he watched as the bonobo killed itself against the glass, in a frenzy of ferocity. When the animal finally lay on the straw-covered floor of the plexiglass cage, a ruined sack of broken bones, Lee hit rewind. He stood and watched once more, that moment in which he and the bonobo faced each other down. As he watched that moment again, he felt strength course through his system, oxygen flowing deep and rich in his veins, bringing blood to his muscular system. He felt each muscle almost separately, felt how well each muscle fit together with the others to form a strong and powerful whole. Though he was on the 22nd floor of a skyscraper in the financial district, he felt as if he were barefoot in the jungle, connected to the earth through skin and blood and bone, taking strength from the earth, giving it back. The hologram switched off, and he went to the window to look out over the city. He lifted his hand and placed it against the glass, and it was as if his hand passed through the glass out into the city, reaching down to the tiny people below, hurrying to get out of the inclement weather. He could swat them away so easily. Such ants, all that toiling and striving, so essentially meaningless, puny and weak and craving direction. Soon their lives would be harnessed to a greater good instead of being so random. He would head a triumphant army of supermen. Hadn't mankind always dreamed of this, of a superior race that could come and lead? All those legends of the gods with immense power over the earth and its creatures. Surely their species knew it was going to end up like this. All Lee had done was speed up the process and place its agency in the right hands. Of course, he had the power of the gods too. He could feel it. Feel vitality run through him. Feel his muscles and sinews reknit into a more powerful whole. Feel his brain rewiring itself. His eyesight was so acute, he thought he could see individual strands of hair in the ant people down below in the street. His hearing was so keen he could hear the centralized air system's gentle hum. It had started to snow, a bit of sleep mixed in, and he could hear each spicule ping against the window panes. He could hear the door opening. God damn it, Lee! Flynn's grating voice boomed. What the fuck were you thinking? A hot mist rose in Lee's mind when he heard Flynn's voice. The prick. The fucking prick. Every cell in his body pulsed with raw, red hatred. Lee flew across the room, grabbing something shiny off his desk, hand punching forward. Flynn's eyes bugged as he looked down at himself at the very small, shiny handle sticking out from his chest. The handle belonged to a pure titanium letter opener that was deeply embedded in his heart. He was dead, but he didn't know it yet. Flynn stood, staggered, righted himself, watching as a big red flower blossomed out from the handle, covering his pristine white Armani shirt. He staggered again and fell to one knee, head hanging. Straining sounds came from his throat, though he wasn't able to formulate any words. Good, Flynn talked too much anyway. Part of Lee admired the fact that from 6 feet away, having had to turn around, pass by his desk to pick up the letter opener, he'd still instinctively been able to punch it straight between the ribs and bury it directly into Flynn's heart. Lee stood above the man, watching as the other knee gave out and he fell prone onto the floor. Flynn's heart continued pumping blood for another 2 minutes, then the flow slowed, then stopped. Lee looked at his reflection in the window, brightly lit against the snowy night sky, as darkness descended in his mind. His eyes were wide, a slight smile on his lips. He watched for a moment, his ability to recognize the creature in the reflection draining away as quickly as Flynn's blood had drained from his body. Lee looked around, not recognizing anything familiar in his surroundings. He moved into a slight crouch, hands pulling up toward his chest, hands open like claws. Walls. He had to get out. Move. His body craved movement, craved blood. It was sheer chance that he moved toward the wall with the door and not to one of the other 3 walls. He walked forward and the door, biomorphic and primed to recognize his profile, opened. He didn't question that. There was very little reasoning ability left in him, just enough to recognize the door with an image of stairs and to realize that it led to an exit. The stairs led to the outside world, a world that awaited him. He started loping for the stairs. A woman stepped out from a door. Her eyes widened when she saw Lee, a binder dropping from her nerveless fingers. Dr. Lee? The tone was a question, but it was never answered. Lee jumped to her, hands out to hold her shoulders still, as he sank his teeth into her neck. In 2 strong bites, he chewed her ear off, then dropped her at his feet, bleeding and twitching. Out. He wanted to be out. He was strong, and he needed to hunt, to kill. He scrambled down the stairs while he still recognized the concept of stairs. By the time he reached the lobby, teeming with people, he'd lost the concept. But it didn't matter because there was plenty of meat here. He still recognized the concept of prey. In the hallway, the woman slowly rose. She raised a hand to the side of her head and frowned. Pain, wet. She had no words for the sensations she could only feel. Her hands drew up to her chest. Formed claws. Kill. She wanted to kill. There was prey around. She could smell it. Unsteady but unyielding, she loped down the corridor where 2 creatures had appeared. Prey. Mount Blue. Eat, Stella Cummings said, pushing a plate of potato gratin across to Lucius. A very small portion, since he'd only begun to tolerate food. She looked across at him, tortured, suffering, yet upright and determined. Any other man would have died 100 times with what had been done to him. What had been done to her by her stalker was a fraction of what had been done to him, and it had almost destroyed her. He was an extraordinary man. That's all you ever say to me, eat, he replied. Dark eyes fixed on her, you'd think I was 5 years old. Even in his weakened and emaciated state, Lucius Ward was a man to be reckoned with. She definitely didn't think he was 5 years old. Eat, she repeated and smiled at him. His face suddenly sharpened. His huge hand covered hers. God, Stella, you are so beautiful. You are so beautiful. She'd heard versions of that phrase all her life. The word had been pretty when she was a child actress, but turned into beautiful right about puberty. Through some accident of bones and hormones, she hadn't gone through an awkward prepubescent phase at all. She'd continued working as an actress all the way through. By the time she was 35, she'd made 120 films and had been considered one of the most beautiful women in the world. What had that gotten her? Not much, besides more work and more work. The men who'd courted her had courted the face, not the person behind it. When they discovered that her life was work, 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 and very little play, the infatuation disappeared. It certainly hadn't brought her love, and now the face was gone. Not so beautiful anymore, Lucius, she said without any sadness. Crazily, her lost beauty had freed something up in her. Everyone in her life now liked her, not her face, like Stella, the member of an underground community, and not Stella, the remote movie star. She was no movie star now. She could never be in the business again. The stalker had sliced her up too badly. 97 slashes all over, 14 to her face. One slice had gone right through her cheek, making it impossible to smile on the right side of her face. She looked like someone had put her in a kaleidoscope and shaken it. His hand tightened on hers. Beautiful, he repeated forcefully. Oh, God. Sex, love, those were things that had completely fled her life after the stalker. There had been lots of sex before, though, not love. But afterward, both had been out of the question. She'd taken refuge in anonymity while her scars had healed as much as they ever would. Cooking near Mount Blue in a small diner belonging to the cousin of her former housekeeper. She'd needed to do something tangible with her hands, the way she'd needed to breathe. And Elena had sent her to her cousin, where she'd bury herself in the kitchen in the back and started creating. The Greasy Spoon became a diner and was on its way to becoming a restaurant when the news told her that her stalker had escaped. She'd been on a break, chatting with a customer, a good-looking, mysterious guy, who showed up from time to time and who never told her his name. If there was one thing Stella had learned in her life to respect, it was privacy. Don't ask, don't tell covered a lot of things, and not just on sexuality. She didn't want to talk about herself, and he didn't want to talk about himself, and that suited them both. And then the news flash. Steve Gardiner, stalker, slasher, and all-around psycho, who had convinced the judge to put him in a mental institution instead of the deepest, darkest cell on earth, had escaped. She had been talking to John when she heard. Suddenly she began to shake all over, the trembles coming from deep in her core. A fear so great she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He'd taken one look at her, seen how terrified and broken she was, and simply brought her up to Mount Blue, to Haven, where she'd joined the community of misfits and runaways and had been happy ever since. Here in Haven, she'd found companionship and purpose, but love? It hadn't even occurred to her that she might find it here, of all places. She looked down at the large hand covering hers. She remembered well that terrible night 3 months ago when Lucius and Miguel Romero, Larry Lundquist, and Bob Pelton had been rescued from a lab that had been like something out of a Nazi concentration camp and brought to Haven. The 4 men had been starved, full of surgical scars, so weak they couldn't walk. It had taken Catherine a week of IVs just to get them to be able to sit up in bed. That's when Stella had taken over, making it her personal mission to get them to eat as much good, nourishing food as they could hold down. Particularly their leader, Lucius Ford, Captain, as Mac, Nick, and John called him. Their respect for him had been evident in every line of their bodies, and once she got to know him, even the terrible, tortured version of him, a strong man who had been rendered down to bedrock, she understood why. This was a formidable man in every sense. She'd seen him put himself together inch by agonizing inch. If Catherine said to walk 10 steps, he'd walk 50, grimacing with pain every inch of the way. And though he never smiled, and the lines in his face clearly showed he'd never been a smiling kind of man, his face lit up when she entered a room. So, yes, wow, sex seemed to be on the table. But something needed to be said first. You don't have to call me beautiful, Lucius, Stella said gently. I know I'm not beautiful, not any longer, and if you don't care, I sure don't. While she talked, his dark eyes roamed over her face, over every inch of it. It was something she was used to. When she'd been beautiful, men had stared openly at her, as if she were something rare and different, belonging to a different species. After she'd been sliced open, people had stared for a different reason, the way you'd stare at a train wreck. One of the many things she loved about Haven was that no one seemed even to notice her scars. Lucius smiled, pulling at the burn scar on his right cheekbone. He brought her hand to his mouth and placed his lips in the palm of her hand. He kept it there for a long time, so long that she moved the tips of her fingers over the skin around his mouth, feeling a few scars, feeling the small bite of his heavy beard. He finally lowered her hand to the table but kept it in his. I never missed a movie of yours. I think I've seen everyone since you were a kid. You had a rare beauty and a rare talent, but I find you more beautiful now, and your talent is one that everyone here appreciates. I know they appreciate it, she smiled at him. The compliments on her cooking were frequent and fervent, and she understood completely. Before she arrived and reorganized the communal kitchen Mac had cooked, every person who told her that had winced. He was searching her eyes again. It looked so penetrating. It was as if he were walking around inside her head. You don't believe me when I say I find you more beautiful than before. She kept an easy smile on her face. Lucius, it's not necessary for you to say that. I don't need it. I know you don't, but I need to say it. Stella. He stopped, licked his lips, swallowed, looked down at their linked hands, then back up at her. If Stella didn't know better, she'd say he was nervous. But that was impossible, of course. Mac, Nick, and John were three of the toughest men on the face of the earth. Capable and brave and determined, they had defied, were still defying, the U.S. government and the entire military. They were unbreakable men, and this man holding her hand was their commanding officer, had led them into battle. That kind of man didn't do embarrassment, and yet... Stella, I have something to say. His voice already hoarse had roughened, and I'm finding it hard. I'm listening, Lucius. She couldn't imagine it hard for Lucius to say anything. He drew in a deep breath. I'm falling in love with you. No, scratch that. I am in love with you since the moment I saw you when we were brought into Haven. Oh, gosh. Tears pricked her eyes. Lucius and the three others had been carried into Haven because they'd been unable to walk. All four of them had been on the verge of death. She remembered Lucius clearly lying on the gurney in the infirmary, a wounded and broken man. It had hurt to look at him, a clearly once strong man who'd been tortured almost to death. Catherine had had a near-death experience herself and was in a coma, so it had been up to Stella and their two nurses, Pat and Salvatore, to take care of everyone. After the attack, Stella had had 4 surgeries and had spent months in the hospital. With nothing else to do, she'd observed the nurses and had a pretty good handle on what to do. Lucius had opened his eyes briefly when she approached him on the gurney. "We'll take care of you," she whispered. He'd nodded and passed out. That was the first time he set eyes on her. Since then, she'd looked after him, not out of pity, oh no. Partly out of rage. She'd been subjected to insane violence too, just as he had. The violence of the cruel and cowardly. She knew exactly what that was like, and the idea of a man like this, a combat hero, who dedicated his life to his country, being tied down like an animal and tormented, it drove her half crazy. But the real reason she looked after him was that she'd seen right through the naked, half-dead man who'd arrived in Haven and saw very, very clearly the extraordinary strong man he'd been. His courage and strength had been clear to her from the start. He'd been smart and strong and brave, handsome even, as she'd been beautiful. And they'd fallen into the hands of monsters. But she came out of it, and he was coming out of it, and in watching him put himself back together, she'd lost her heart to him. He reached out a hand to her face, finger trying to trace the worst scar of all, running from her left eyebrow down to the right jaw, the one that had taken 64 stitches to close. She was lucky to have a functioning eye. Instinctively, Stella reared back. No one had touched it since the surgeon had taken out the stitches. "No, no," he whispered. "No, darling. Shh, let me touch." His finger, slightly rough, traced the deep white scar over and over again, slowly, from end to end. That had been the first slash, the stalker having taken her completely by surprise. Her entourage had known for years that she had a violent stalker. Nobody told her, the idea being that she'd, quote-unquote, lose her focus, and they'd lose their gravy train. The stalker had sent her menacing letters, horrific gifts, had made threatening phone calls, all intercepted. The man she'd considered her personal assistant was a bodyguard. His dead body had been found just outside her bedroom door, lying in a pool of blood. It was the cut that had hurt the most, slicing her face and her life in two. Lucius's touch was so gentle, his eyes so understanding. They just sat there in the quiet room, his finger tracing her worst nightmare from temple to chin. His thumb wiped away the fat tears that welled from her eyes. His eyes, they knew her somehow. No one had known her. Her fame had been like a stone wall between her and the rest of humanity. Even her lovers pleasured her body without ever touching her heart. They didn't want to touch her heart anyway. That had always been very clear. This man with the ruined face and broken body, this man touched her heart. A sob escaped her, quickly stifled. She never cried, ever. The tears were a mistake. "Hush, darling," he said, that deep voice so tender. "I haven't finished talking yet." She nodded, throat too tight for words. "I love you, Stella. I know I have nothing to offer you, not even myself. I can barely stand upright. I have no career, no place to call my own but here. I am a hunted man, together with the others. Should we be caught, we'd be court-martialed, but I don't think we'd make it to a tribunal. They'd shoot us first. I don't have anything resembling a future. I'm not even fully a man again, but I swear no one else could ever love you like I do. Someday I'll be whole. I believe that completely. It won't be today, and it won't be tomorrow, but do you think you could wait for me?" That strong, scarred, beloved face was open for her to read, to see his anxiety. Those dark eyes were locked onto hers. The tears were falling freely now, catching on her upturned lips. She cupped his face with her free hand. "I'm not going to wait for you, Lucius." He flinched and she clutched his hand harder. "I don't have to wait. I'm already yours." "Do you think John will find a clue in Elle's house?" Catherine came out of the bathroom with perfume steam billowing behind her, like some goddess coming out of mists of time. Billowing steam, goddesses, mists of time. Christ. Mac didn't realize the thoughts in his head these days. They were totally unlike the thoughts of Mac BC before Catherine. He seemed to be having a lot of those thoughts nowadays, though. Everything in his life had changed since Catherine, not least the small bump showing in her belly. When he saw it, when he touched it, his heart gave a huge kick in his chest. His child, their child. Though Catherine was his heart and life, this child would be his only blood relative in the world. Just thinking about it gave him the shivers. Catherine walked to their bed, smiling sadly. If anyone knew what it was like to be hunted down by the goons of Arca Pharmaceuticals, it was Catherine. Mac held his arms out and grunted with satisfaction when she went into them. The world was fucked up almost beyond repair, but when his arms closed around his wife, he could almost hear an audible click, as if a piece of sophisticated machinery were working well. He ran a hand down her dark, soft hair. "If John doesn't find what we need tonight, we'll just attack it full bore tomorrow. Everyone will pitch in. We'll figure it out." Looking down, he could see her smile, felt her head nod against his shoulder. And I'm going to pause on page 256 and finish this chapter later.